Great. Thank you so much, Hunter. It's exciting. When Hunter asked me to do this, I was a little apprehensive, but it's been a really fun journey. And so tonight we're going to examine images that depict plague victims and take a look at specific saints associated with the plague, giving us an understanding of the massive loss of life in Europe from the Middle Ages to the Baroque and art. And the thing that's been most interesting for me is the parallels between COVID and the plague. I mean, we just, as I walk you through, I think you'll see the parallels. So there were three types of plagues starting from the Middle Ages: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. But we're going to focus on bubonic. And there are a lot of inaccuracies when, well, in the years when scholars have been looking at plague, a lot of the images where you see people covered in tumors, those are typically leprosy, but we're going to focus on bubonic images. So the image that we see before us is kind of typical of a plague image. This is Milan, and again, the parallels between COVID and the plague are very interesting. So in October 1629 in Milan, is the image we're looking at now. This is one of a set of 20 etchings that were produced by an Italian etcher. They strict plague regulations were put in place, but then in March of the next year, so 1630, restrictions had eased, and they went ahead with Carnival. This is Italy, and there was a massive outbreak, and approximately 60,000 of a population of 120,000 were infected. So, I mean, the parallels are kind of uncanny. So, from the late 14th century, European artists began to depict the plague through art. Artists created images through a variety of media. We're primarily going to look at prints and paintings, but they created imagery in other media as well. And it follows a similar literary trend as well. Ovid, the Bible, Homer, Virgil, Boccaccio's Decameron, in his intro, discusses the plague in detail. So the frustrating thing, of course, dating back to medieval or Middle Ages, is that they didn't have the scientific information. So we know today that it arrived from Asia via the ports, and it basically went along for 400 years. The pathogen wasn't discovered until the 1890s. There were many theories. There were just a rapid number of theories as why that the plague was so vapid. And in 1347, the bubonic plague or Black Death struck Europe. Today, we know it was severe bacterial infection. It's called the Yersinia pestis, based on the scientists named eventually for the scientists who, in the late 19th century, made the discovery. So between the years 1347 and 1553, not even a decade, a fourth of the European population died. if we look at this map, it gives us an idea of how rapidly, if you look at the orange, so it spread through the ports, basically via Asia trade. So vessels coming through Asia back into Europe. But if you look at 1347 versus 1349, you look at the rapid transmission. So there's a really wonderful on Amazon Prime. There's a 23 episode. She's a professor of history at Purdue, but she's produced this 23 series documentary on the plague, the spread of the plague. But if we look at this map, just starting with the orange, 1347, so we think of these are ships, and then these ships are coming into port. So they're coming from Asia, but then they're making pit stops, and they're maybe going a pit stop in Sicily and then going to Venice, and it's spreading throughout the port. So it spreads via sea, and then it begins to spread internally. So today we know, of course, that transmission was via fleas, and they would bite a warm-blooded thing. And then the plague would cause the flea to be think that it was not, it would obstruct its digestive tract, and it would think the flea was still hungry, so it would obstruct the digestive tract. But in essence, the flea was just regurgitating infected microbes onto the individual. Incubation was quick, 2 to 8 days. And again, it's interesting, the parallels to COVID. Symptoms, these blisters that would form at the lymph nodes, chills, fever, weakness, diarrhea. And typically at the lymph nodes, there were these bulbos that they would form. We'll talk about them shortly. It's thought that it could be passed through coughing and sneezing, but there were some positives. Sanitary commissions were formed and built. In the Middle Ages, probably only 10%, probably the nobles and the priests were literate. So small part of the population. Health pamphlets were distributed, they were probably read. But there were quarantines that were put in place, and clothing and bedding of the sick and dead were burned. And then finally, in the 18th century, there were very strict border controls put in place at the sea and land. So when new arrivals would be quarantined before they could, depart the ship and what have you. The image at the left is from Diderot's famous encyclopedia, who he covered everything from shipbuilding to glassmaking to, you have it, just a remarkable scientific endeavor, but he includes a scientific sort of endeavor of the flea. So let me point out just for a moment. So the term bubonic comes from the buboes that formed on the body, typically at the lymph nodes. And the term Black Death refers to the horror, but it wasn't coined for centuries later. And those of you who are familiar with art history terminology, that will make sense. But during the period in Middle Ages, so we're going to start with the Middle Ages, it was referred to as the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. So these are things to keep in mind. So ancient authors, as well as Judeo-Christian authors, suggested that the plague was a divine punishment for human transgression on the population. And in the Golden Legend, which was a very popular publication, um, even at the advent of the printing press, more popular than the Bible, a Genoese bishop said that the people of Rome who had lapsed into sin basically had been sinning for their excesses. That basically this was the thought process that the plague had been brought on by inappropriate behavior. And only a few people during, and we're talking about the Middle Ages, thought that the plague had been brought on by natural causes. Pagan and Christian sources, and there are multiple sources that cite this, cite astronomical phenomena. And then there are other sources, polluted air that comes from clouds or from the ground. And then there's this idea of miasma, bad air. And the image that we're looking at on the left is an image out of Belgium. And there are many tales and recordings of mass graves, but there was an attempt to bury people in coffins. So that's what we're seeing here is a Belgian image. It's actually a very early image where we see all these coffins that are being brought forward and then laid into the ground. Although I will say there are again multiple instances of mass graves. This is a really wonderful representation. This is an image. It's somewhat obscure. It's a chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian, who is one of the plague saints we're going to talk about shortly. But this is a chapel dedicated to Saint Sebastian. It's deep in the Alps, close to Italy. But and unfortunately I couldn't get a whole image of the chapel, but it's a beautiful, stunning chapel, just visually lovely. But the images are under strict protocols, so I couldn't get an image of the whole chapel. But it's wonderful for us because we see, on the right we see this physician who appears to be lancing a bulbo, and his assistant is supporting her. And then if we look, this is just one of the images. These are frescoes, so they're paintings on wet plaster. This man is upholding his arm, and this is the typical sort of gesture to the bulbo, and then this young child also. And then if we look over to the right, the angel, I'm not sure if y'all can see this, but there's also, it's an angel with a prospect of death, tends to be pointing. And so there was this association with the plague and sin, not recognizing it till the 19th century with an actual bacterial infection, but because you had transgressed in some way. So this is a fresco. And then moving forward, I know this is a little hard to read, but this is a woodcut. So a woodcut, so you're carving out the areas around the image. And this is an image from Petrarch, actually. And there were hundreds and hundreds of images, both supposedly medically or not, on how to basically assuage the plague. And so we see this man here. Trying to get my pointer. But anyway, the man, back. No, sorry. All right, so we see the man here, and he is obviously, his bulbo is being expressed onto the bed linens. His two attendants are covering their noses. And I mean, honestly, through all the research I did, I don't know whether, so there was this idea of the miasma, the bad air, or I'm sure that the stench from bleeding or expressing the bulbos was also gross. So, I mean, there's some stuff that's lost to medicine, but this image gives us a little more information. Apparently, laying on the side or laying kind of sideways would alleviate the pain of the bulbo. And so we have a number of attending officials. This individual here is probably a doctor, and they would hold a vinegar sponge to their mouth. This gal here, maybe in prayer, but this young man here, who is also holding his nose, apparently it's been suggested he's taken a urine sample. And then the woman on the other side of the bed, who also holds her nose, she's holding out a bowl, perhaps a broth. And then the figure here that has a turban, the scholarship suggests that during, this is 1600s, 1512, that the Eastern medicine was just a slightly more advanced than Western medicine. And so there are, we know that during the plague that Western doctors consulted Eastern books of medicine or treatises, medical treatises. So there are multiple instances where a turban figure is represented, perhaps recognizing that. And then this perhaps is a type of herb wrap that would have been lit on fire to perhaps help medically. But perhaps was one of the things that really worked, that it probably did keep the fleas at bay. This is probably one of the most iconic images, even though depicted here, it's pictured in jest. It is a German depiction, and it is titled Dr. Schnauzball. And Schnauzball is a German interpretation for bee, literally. But there are documentation of physicians and other individuals. In fact, there's lots of interpretation of physicians and priests and others that fled. And so people would dress up in these costumes, and they look like claws, but they're actually gloves. But they would dress up in these kind of connotations and with the hat, but they would stuff the beak with, again, a vinegar sponge or a sponge of herbs. And so, you know, it's very interesting. I mean, there's so many parallels between, but this is an iconic image. And in fact, one of my friends from graduate school sent me on Etsy, you can buy one of these beaks. So faith played a big role in the plague, and kind of in two different spheres. So there were plague saints, saints that were associated with a specific city. Um, and Dr. Louise Marshall, who is a art historian at the University of Sydney in Australia, she suggests that essentially the saints that are associated with the city provided a link between the earthly world and the heavens, and so they kind of provided a city. And we have to remind ourselves that, especially in Italy, this is a Catholic nation, even though it wasn't it was divided up into city states and different principalities and what have you. But it was very important for their city. There are other suggestions and folk beliefs, and these play out through either plague saints or either saints that are associated with specific cities, swords, darts, and arrows, meaning they were kind of what's the word I'm looking for? They were kind of the munition, like they were severing the plague, if you will. Then there's the idea of the memento mori. And memento mori is this idea that we all know where we're going to die, but it's a symbol. So it's almost kind of dust to dust, that we all will return to the earth, but it's a symbol. Sometimes there were family symbols, and they could play out in other ways. Then we have dark clouds, astrological signs, comets, and they were often referred to. Again, there wasn't a lot of separation between medical knowledge and astrological astronomy science during the plague. And some of the images we're going to look at now, rather than we might see them as kind of depressing, they were meant for hope and sort of giving hope to what was going on. This is a small image that is part of a larger altarpiece that has been distributed throughout the world. In fact, this is the Walters Art Museum just up the road, but parts of it are at the Hermitage, Pennsylvania Museum of Fine Arts, and what have you. But we're fortunate to have this example. This artist, Josie Liefrenix, who was originally from the Netherlands, but spent most of his career in France. This is Saint Sebastian interceding for the plague. And Sebastian is one of the saints that was kind of brought up slightly from obscurity. He was a Roman military officer, and he was martyred. Okay, if you are born in the 20th century, you'll know it as 300 AD, but if you are more millennium, you'll know it as 300 BCE. But anyway, he was martyred because he was found out as a Christian. He was a Roman military officer. He was originally shot through arrows, and he survived, and then he was clubbed to death. And so he had attended to the sick, attended to the plague victims, and so he kind of becomes a natural sort of inclusion into plague iconography. This is an instance that took place, the image we're looking at here, long after his death. This is so he lived like 300 BCE. But what we're looking at here is an image, even though it was done during the 15th century, it was a situation that occurred during the 7th century in Pavia, Italy, where Sebastian interceded for the plague victims here. And there are multiple, and that's part of the problem with plague iconography, because during the onset of the plague in the Middle Ages and then going up to the 18th century, artists recognized earlier plagues, so to kind of make part of the current plague, if that makes any sense. But what we see here, we have Saint Sebastian, as he's typically seen, being full of arrows. He's pleading with God for the city of Pavia. Now, the interesting thing is Lee Freniks, the artist, he had never been to Pavia. He was from the Netherlands, but based his career in France. And so he based the village that we see here on Avignon, the French town of Avignon. But it gives us a lot of detail, because we see they knew enough to shroud the plague victims. And we see one here, here, and then even going through the city arcs, we see here. And then we see the clergy. They're probably giving, well, not the last rites, the rites of burial. We see a bucket of holy water. And then we see this woman in horror. We also look back up to the sky and we see the devil and angel going to battle. So it's kind of a literal back and forth between. But then if we look at this figure here, he's fallen, we see this bulbo, which is kind of this telltale sign of the plague. And, you know, he kind of becomes this icon of the plague. The other saint who really becomes kind of the hero of the plague, and we see kind of cross-culturally, is Saint Roch. This is an Spanish representation by Francisco Rebalta, done during the Baroque in 1625. And Saint Roch, it depends on your English, he translates to Saint Roch, but he was from a noble French family. His parents died when he's a young man, and he gives away all his possessions as like Saint Francis of Assisi. He then travels to Rome, and he gets sick with the plague himself, and so he goes in the woods, and he is befriended by a dog of a nobleman as well as a nobleman. And we can see here, there's a dog, he has the bread in his mouth. And this is typically how Saint Roch is depicted. He's typically shown showing a bulbo on his thigh. And Saint Roch became very popular because he had supposedly survived the plague. And he was kind of, as Sebastian, shown as a martyr, and it's been suggested that he welcomed his disease as a divinely sent opportunity to imitate the sufferings of Christ. His patience, endurance of physical suffering of plague was a form of martyrdom. And so he is depicted over and over again. In fact, an artist that may be more familiar, Peter Paul Rubens, in his Christ appointing a patron saint of the plague, depicts him. It's still in situ today at St. Martin's in Belgium. And this is an interesting painting because it's divided into two spheres. We have kind of the sick and the dying down here, And then we have the the heavenly spheres that appear before us. And excuse me, we have Jesus. They're lit from the back with a moon, and then he is pointing to an angel who's holding a plaque, and she is holding a plaque that essentially translates to "You are the patron during the pestilence," and then poor Rob, he points to himself as like, "Who, me? Really?" Um, but um, he takes it in vain, and his dog is the dog who becomes his symbol, is at his side. And then we have suffering below, and this is true Baroque art that we're seeing here, sort of the drama, the colors, the exaggeration of the people. And then we have this figure here that really unites the upper and the lower stage of what's going on here. So the earth and and the heavenly sphere. As I mentioned, this work is still in situ in Belgium. You can see the elaborate frame here. It's not a great image, but the elaborate frame. And then there are a number of other works that surround it. Tintoretto, another artist that's probably familiar to most people, and this work is also still in situ today in Venice. He, of course, I'm sorry, as you probably know, he's a Venetian artist, born in Venice in 1519, and then quickly became, after serving a short stint with Titian, became independent. And this this work is at a church that's dedicated to Saint Roch. And again, it's still in situ in Venice. But what we see here before us is kind of a dark room. We think it's probably a chapel or church because there appears to be a crucifix in the background. But Saint Roch here with his illuminated, his illumination essentially is laying on hands. And then we see sufferers all around. We see bulbos all around. The three men over here. There's the woman. We see all throes of, and I think I haven't stopped to point this out, but the mortality rates were pretty severe, even though this is, my figure is from a later outbreak. You know, it typically, especially in Italy, because of all the ports, 50 to 65%, their mortality rates were exceedingly grim. If we look at a couple details, you can see the bulbos here, here, and then the figure. Usually in art, they're pointing to them. But in this image, Saint Roch has saved the day, and he has at least cured. And this is the stunning church in Venice. And then, I don't know if you can see here, but it's on the right as you approach the altar. It's just a stunning, stunning survival. So I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about saints associated with the plague, and I haven't mentioned any, but Saint Gennaro, and it depends on what translation you're looking at. Sometimes it's spelled with a J. But he was the patron saint of Naples. And this work, typically a rich person would commission an altarpiece, but this was commissioned by a viceroy who was active during the plague. And again, like most areas, uh, Naples suffered a vast loss, 60% of the population. This is a work by, and I know a lot of the works we've looked at are not by well-known artists, but Luca Giordano, and this is Saint Gennaro liberates Naples from the plague. And so this is an instance where we see a, a saint associated with a city. So this is Gennaro, and he's kind of floating in between. And this is what I mentioned before. So these city saints, and typically Italian cities were, they were kind of intermediaries between the earthly and the heavenly. So we have Gennaro here floating, and then we have the dead down here, and then we have Mary, and literally we have Jesus bearing the cross. And if we look at details, this is kind of typical of how artists would depict. Let's go back. So this is into the 17th century. So we're well into the Baroque. But this is kind of typical, and we see some bulbos here, kind of this grayish, decaying, kind of almost disgusting way. This is kind of typical of how artists would kind of depict artists going forward. And then back to Milan. This is Jacob Jordan, and an Italian artist. This is St. Charles Borromeo, cares for the plague victims of Milan. And Borromeo is an interesting figure because when many priests, doctors, and other figures were fleeing the city, he stayed. And he not only stayed, but he became an archbishop, which we see him here. But he also threw in his own money. He laid on hands. He was very hands-on. He offered. He set regulations for trying to diminish the plague. And so this altarpiece, and I think I've mentioned this before. So by this point in we're in mid 17th century. We're a little more literate, but 10 to 20% of the population was literate. So these were altarpieces that were created and put in churches to kind of give a visual narrative. But Borromeo was very remarkable because he, as I mentioned, he gave his own money. He really was a humanitarian. And so this altarpiece was commissioned in his honor. And if we look, it's worthwhile to notice the lace and his stole, but also to come down and look at, and so Christ and the Virgin Mary were a typical representation, and he's sort of being offered up for his thanks. And then this gentleman has expired, but then if we look at the suckling child, and this is kind of a typical image where a suckling child to someone is a woman that's expired from the plague. Sadly, the child is going to get the plague if she suckles. And so the woman covering her nose is going to, she's trying to remove the child. So I think Hunter's probably going to be pushing me along, but quickly, this is kind of a crude woodcut, but it's entitled Christ the Judge. It's from actually an English publication, and it's an example of one of the kind of it basically roughly translates to a regimen of the plague, but there's actually a lot going on here. So we have Christ And then we have a lily, a sword. We have a pietà over here. We have someone giving their last communion over here. And then we have, again, Sebastian and St. Roch. And then in the center, we have St. Michael. We have a skeleton of the Psyche. And then we have a bishop, and a priest. And then what appears to be, perhaps two dead children. And this is kind of an example of memento mori in a way, in that there's signs of death, and the memento mori is like they're all signs of death. We all know that we're going to die, but it's kind of all about the symbolism. This is kind of a dramatic image. This is from Naples, and it's an artist that Domenico Garluli, who was also known as Miko Sparaggio. And today, this piazza is known as the Piazza Dante, but it kind of gives you a visual of the vast death and dying at Naples, and we can go back and look, and they're pretty succinct numbers as far as the death and the city. And so if we look here, this is from the left hand of the painting. We see coffins, we see individuals that are wrapped. Again, we see another image of a suckling. And then if we look up to the heavens, we see what is kind of an angry Lord, or a very angry Lord. And he has been described as such, a very angry Lord. And the fact that Mary, his mother, is trying to console him. And so we can interpret this in a variety of ways, whether, the angry Lord has cast this plague on the city, or whether she is begging forgiveness, begging for him to see a more just way. We're not quite certain. And then this last image I would like to leave you with is kind of interesting. It is today in the collection of the Vatican, and it's titled the Madonna da Plingo. And Plingo is a city in central Italy, and the gentleman that commissioned this work from Raphael, and interesting enough, this work has kind of come full circle, because when this work was commissioned, Raphael was actually working at the Vatican, but it was commissioned by a gentleman called Conti. His last name was Conti, and it was commissioned for the Church of Santa Maria de Arguia in Rome. And it eventually travels a couple places. It makes its way to a monastery in Foligno, and it goes to France, and then eventually is in a collection of the Vatican in Rome. But there are two different interpretations of this, which I think it's an interesting way to end this lecture. So if you go to the Vatican website and look at it, they suggest one interpretation. Well, let me just kind of give you an overview. So this is the donor, Conti, and this is Saint Jerome. Then we have St. John the Baptist over here with his animal skins, and St. Francis. Then we have a putti in the center. For whatever reason, the plaque has never been, was never completed. So perhaps it was to give glory to Conti, who Jerome is being offered up to the Virgin Child. So according to the Vatican's interpretation, Conti commissioned this work to give thanks to the Virgin Mary for sparing his home and Fellini from a strike from lightning. Now, another more recent interpretation by an art historian who interprets the plague suggested something else. And I think this is where it becomes interesting. The art historian that I'm referencing suggests the rainbow and the comet theory. And if we reference my work over here to the right, if you'll just let me read. So, rainbow and comet, the theory that the heavenly bodies were responsible for pestilential air was widespread and originated in antique texts well into 16th century literature. Comets were believed to be dry, hot secretions that were drawn by stellar power into the atmosphere where they ignite. And these depictions date back to Aristotle. So Renaissance scientific literature depicted comets below a rainbow, which was explained as a cloud saturated by moisture that gets its color from the sun's reflection. The two phenomena, comet and rainbow, were thought to change the atmosphere, causing miasmic air to form, which in turn breeds disease. And it is noted that a comet appeared in 1511. So I will leave you this evening with these two interpretations of this one painting by Raphael. I think both are interesting. I personally think it looks more like a comet, but everything is open to interpretation.
Randy, thank you so much. That's the end of your presentation?
Yes.
There's not too many questions on there. If you have questions now, feel free to put them in the chat box or pipe up as you'd like. We have a few minutes for question and answer. I found it to be very interesting at the beginning of her presentation where she put the map. Was it the bubonic plague, Randy?
Yes.
How much more slowly, illness spread back in that time due to the lack of what, Laurie called globalization. It took five years to spread it around in what we've done very, very quickly. I thought that was interesting. Maybe this question might be for Brooke or Laurie. One of the questions, all those cysts that I saw, were they spreading the illness more by expressing them?
That I don't know. And a lot of the images you see, in fact, even one of the books I consulted, a lot of the images you see where people are covered in what look like bulbos, those are typically leprosy, not bubonic plague. And that's kind of been a recent determination.
Is there a doctor that can weigh in on this that knows? I'm just saying, this looks like the OG Dr. Pimple Popper, if you ask me.
Oh,
this
totally.
is the original Dr. Pimple Popper back in the 50s.
Gross!
And I'd like to, I don't know if there are more questions, but I would just like to leave you guys with that link to where I have found a Dr. Schnabel mask for less than $25 that I will be ordering for both of my parents.
Yes, you can get them on Etsy.
Yes, for the person that has everything on their Christmas list, a Dr. Schnabel mask is, I think, what the doctor ordered for Christmas 2020.
And you need the herbs to stuff.
Okay. Well, Brooke
Will
Cooper
it replace
says,
an N25?
do what? I'm just saying.
Will it replace an N25 mask or a cloth mask?
It clear. I mean, you stuff something in there and light something on fire, it's bound to be better than an N95 mask, Charlie. And you look like you look like a real bad bird, Charlie. So Brooke Cooper said all of her patients feel better. All of your patients feel better after the bubonic plague? All right, so Judith Brown says, and Laurie says, yes, there was Yersinia bacteria in the lymph nodes. So I think the Dr. Pimple Popper was probably making it a little bit worse. So do you have any idea how many outbreaks of plague occurred in Europe during each century?
Me?
Yes, or anybody.
Not off the top of my head, but I certainly can
look into that.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely, even though the the scientific information wasn't until the end of the 19th century, they understood that it was spread very rapidly. So, I mean, they were doing almost everything that we're doing. Like, they were shutting down ports, they were shutting down land travel, they were quarantining. And I mean, that in that first example of Milan, they had quarantine, and then it's almost iconic where they had a shutdown, and then in the fall, and then they had carnival in the spring, and there was a mass outbreak.
So it's like right back to where we are right now.
Yeah, I mean it that's what it made so interesting for me. And I have lots more images than the ones I showed you all, but the parallels, that was just the most interesting.
One of the interesting parallels to me is I was looking at your slides, and it looks like as early as 1613 they were painting pictures of folks who had their face covered. I don't know if they realized that it was preventing infection, or if it just smelled so bad that they were covering their face.
And that, yes. And but I think that plays into these four humors too, where they thought that it was bad, or like bad air was.
Hey, Randy,
Yes.
this is Jim. Thanks. This has been absolutely amazing. A question related to you started earlier on talking about Saint Sebastian, and he's a 3rd century saint, but he doesn't really appear much until the 17th century, which is interesting. And he always appeared. So he was martyred because he went back to Diocletian, who was the emperor,
Right.
Who had him kind of whacked off the first time, and he went back to him to hold him accountable for his sins. There was a desire for repentance. So usually in the church, when we talk about Saint Sebastian, we talk about someone who goes to hold the world to accountability. So I guess a call to repentance and acknowledgement. And it's interesting, as you were saying, for me in the plague, that it's seen as this curse from God. So that's God's holding us to accountability. Did you find any like typical expressions of repentance in like 17th century art, or does that question make any sense?
Yeah, no, it totally does. And I didn't examine it from that standpoint, but that is a very legitimate way of looking at it, and I think that could be revisited. But I did not examine it. But I'm an Episcopalian, so I'm not terribly familiar with Saint Sebastian and Saint Roch, these saints. So I'm kind of examining them from an academic perspective. But
well, I guess my question is more like when you look at the overall in art in the context of what you've been showing us, sort of this calling, the holding out, using the plague as God's judgment, or
right.
you want to word that. are there particular themes that or settings or scenes that show up more often than others, or?
Yes, yes, I would definitely say so. And you know, in this whole period, you've got the Reformation, Counter Reformation. You know, you've got
Mhm.
a lot of, I mean, throughout Europe, you've got a lot of unrest, religious unrest. You've got, you know, Catholic countries, not, you know, you've got Protestantism that's forming. So I have not specifically examined it in that way, but I would say yes, that
Cool. Thanks. Yeah,
I
it's
think
just
that's a great question, Joe.
My mother is asking how large was that painting towards the end that had so many people in it. I think that was a I don't know if it was a 1600 painting. It's too
The
large for you to
Raphael?
put in the Northminster house, Mom.
The Raphael? Or
Yeah, the very last painting that had everybody dying and people wrapping them up, and it made
the
me,
Naples.
me personally, this presentation made me thankful for 2020 for the first time.
It
All
does. I will say it makes you thankful for modern medicine.
Yes, it makes me thankful for modern medicine. Christina Orog says there are 3 great pandemics of plague recorded in 541, 1347, and 1894. So yes.
And I should give a shout out. There's a wonderful, it's available on Amazon Prime. It's a woman, she's a history professor at Purdue. It's a 23 episode, and a friend of mine from graduate school pointed out to me after I had started the research. But it's really wonderful, very detailed. 23 on Amazon Prime.
23 will get us.
Yeah, and they're only, I mean, the episodes are on like 20 minutes, so it's very watchable.
Super.
I found, this is Peggy, and I found it very curious that so many of those paintings with shrouds, people being wrapped and people dying, were actually in chapels when normally, you know, the things that patrons would pay to, you know, to adorn a chapel would be something more to the glory of God rather than what was going. Not all of them reference the Lord in judgment and such. Some of them just seem to be depictions of the plague at the time.
But isn't that, I mean, didn't Randy feel like that? Didn't Randy mention that a lot of folks in the day felt like that the plague was a result of sin? So
Yes.
what I wonder if it was a reference or a
To-
connotation to, you know, what happens
better
when you
watch
sin.
out and be good.
Yeah. Get your act together. You're going to be like seething with cysts.
Yeah, and
I
that's
don't know.
probably the case.
I mean, you have to remember, it wasn't until 1890 that the bacterial strain was identified. So,
Well, this has been very interesting. I appreciate you. We're at the end of the hour.